Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are hanging out with Dr. Radhika Desai. She is a very smart person who knows a lot about economics, unlike me. And we need to talk about what happened at Davos, the speeches, what they mean, if anything. And of course, we need to talk about something that I think is critical, and that is, and I'll explain why, Dr. Desai. I went on this podcast recently, and I was kind of, it wasn't intended to be a debate, but it ended up kind of being one. And basically, there are a lot of people who basically say, Trump is playing 7D chess. He's doing this because of this, and then he's going to do that. Like he's a devious, diabolical guy who ultimately he means good. But he's so smart that it's almost impossible for us to understand what he's doing because of the level of brilliance and tactics that he is employing. But for some reason, people who really, really, really support everything he has ever done are able to figure out and identify with his brilliance, and they can see where it's going. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I really don't think Trump's that complicated, but who knows? We need to listen to others anyway. So let's start with this. These speeches at Davos, I think the one that sticks out at me is Mark Carney, jumps out at me. And so I will not ask any leading questions to the witness. I'll get out of the way and let you tell me what you think of Mark Carney's speech, and we'll go move on to other things, and then I'll comment afterwards. Dr.
Sure.
Desai.
Yeah, thank you, Garland, and please call me Radhika. I'm not Dr.
Okay.
Desai,
Okay.
not to you anyway. But okay, so here's the thing. So actually, I want to talk both about Carney and about Trump. So let me just say, because what you were saying, you put it so well that I felt I have to take the opportunity to respond. So you're right. Everybody gets all excited. Trump basically lives on producing a new shockingly pink rabbit out of his hat every 2 or 3 days, right? So everybody goes, oh my God, look at that. What is he doing now? And, and of course, as you say, it's not just his sympathizers. Even some of his worst critics are still looking for the method in the madness. And somehow, he's doing, and they fall for the idea that there is novelty, that every apparently new thing he does is new, but actually underlying the appearance of novelty, there is a dreary sameness. Because we've been watching this show since he was elected, even a little bit before he was elected, certainly since his inauguration. So basically, he produces some great big shock. And then everybody is shocked and the markets go up and down, and everybody's on this emotional roller coaster and so on. And then after a few days, there's some kind of, there's blowback. Of course, if the markets react badly, he immediately turns right around, or somebody else reacts as they must. It's not like people can give in to what he wants. So they must react in some way, and then he climbs down and so on. So basically, we've had this taco scenario be repeating itself. Taco standing for Trump always chickens out. So you've got this thing, and we are kind of being, at one level, it's a different show. It's Venezuela, it's Iran, it's Greenland. Now it's going to be something else. I think it's back to Iran again, and we're talking about Russia and so on, whatever. It looks like it's a different thing, but it's the same thing every time. And it's, I was trying to think of an analogy, and I thought, imagine if you owned a cinema hall and you had at your disposal, I don't know, a couple of dozen films, and you never showed each film in its entirety. What you did is you sort of just showed sort of a few sections, whiz bang, everything blows up, really good sections, and then after a little while you shift to a new one, and from that film as well you show all the whiz bang, and that's kind of what Trump does anyway. So that's about Trump. So as we saw, he built up all the tension around Greenland and so on. And I think it was absolutely calculated so that the entire world would be hanging on every last word that he uttered in that rambling speech that he gave. God, I mean, I couldn't watch all of it because I was somewhere else, but I did watch quite a lot of it. Absolutely nuts. Anyway, and what were the takeaway messages? the whole world is listening to me. I can do whatever I like, and blah blah and so on. And then the latter part, which was supposed to be the main thrust of it, I've been such a great president, and of course everything Trump says is absolutely studded with superlatives, like the greatest, the best, blah blah, etc. Anyway, so that's about Trump, and I think that I was certainly expecting, and I said before that to several friends, and I think perhaps even on a show or something, he's not going to attack Greenland. There's absolutely no way. I mean, anyway, um, so that's Trump. Carney is really interesting, and of course, as you know, he was lauded for giving the best speech ever at Davos or something like that. And to understand Ghani, and people are saying, he has shown us the way how to stand up to Trump, etc. But the way I would like to understand him is, I would like to use an expression, use a sentence that he used twice. Once when he was in Beijing, just prior to going to Davos, and then again in Davos, and he said something like, we can't expect, we don't live in the world we wish to have. We have to deal with the world as it is, or something like that. So sure, I mean, he is certainly being forced by the relatively harsh treatment that Canada is getting from the United States under Trump. He's certainly being forced to deal with the world as it is, or at least with Trump as he is. But the important thing to remember about Carney and all the people who are his great admirers is that the world they wish for has not changed. These shocks of the last many years has not made them think, oh, you know what, maybe there was something wrong with the world as we wish to see it. And so they continue to wish for that. And remember, of course, all the Europeans and Carney and everybody got really hot under the collar about Denmark's sovereignty and blah, blah, and so on. Meanwhile, they're all cheering the violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. They have been participating in the violation of the sovereignty of all the countries against whom illegal unilateral sanctions have been imposed for simply pursuing their own legitimate interests. So in all of these ways, I would say that, a leopard does not change his spots. I mean, let me put it this way. These leopards, who are spotted in the globalization spots, they are not going to change their spots that quickly. I think that, quite frankly, they represent one side of a larger political conflict that overspills the boundaries of individual countries. So just as Trump, for example, encourages the AfD or Nigel Farage or what have you in Britain, and he did in Argentina. He said that, if you re-elect or vote for the party of Milei, I will give so much money and so on. So he is participating in a broader international civil war, and in this international civil war, it's very funny. You'd think that there would be two completely opposed sides. They're not two completely opposed sides. They're basically the likes of the Starmers or the Bidens or the Matzes and so on the one hand, and the kind of Trump AfD types, on the other, the extreme right on the other. But their methods may seem quite different. They are not quite that different, because remember, Biden has done many of the same things as Trump has done. Their methods may seem quite different, but they're actually not so different, but their aims are the same. It is to preserve the rule of the same corporate capitalist class that has been supported by every major government in the Western world since the onset of neoliberalism, and nothing has changed there. The big problem that we face is that there is no left that is capable of uniting everybody who is paying for this with their, with their misery, with their unemployment, with their low wages, with their inflation, and often with their lives. And we have not created that left yet. But otherwise, I mean, this is all this drama is taking place on the right side of the political spectrum. Meanwhile, nothing as much is happening on the left side of the political spectrum.
I agree with you in a lot of ways. The Carney speech, I viewed the same contradictions. Hooray, you did, and even a note from Macron, great job with Venezuela, but you're not supposed to apply those standards to us. Okay, we're down when it comes to Iran. We're on board with that. What you want to do is you want to attack them economically, destroy them economically, and steal everything they have, take their country. Venezuela, good work, violate their sovereignty, don't even recognize them as human beings that have a right to sovereignty, all of the above. Okay. However, we're supposed to be on board with that. Remember, we're on the team. You don't do that to us. We all work together to do that to others so we can all benefit. It's like they're looking at it saying, look, you're doing the things that we used to do to everybody, and we all got our fair share of the loot. Now you want to just leave the criminal enterprise and do that yourself without us getting our share of the loot, number one. And to some extent, you're going to do it to us too. No, that's the way I read it.
Yes, in fact, I have, earlier this month, I wrote a piece on what Trump did in Venezuela. And since everybody's talking about the Monroe Doctrine and the Donroe Doctrine and what have you, I actually spent a bit of time discussing that. And I think people, there's a very interesting, and I'm coming to this whole who to apply standards to. This is the whole point. But the Monroe Doctrine was first enunciated by President Monroe in the very early on in the history of the United States. By the way, this year will be the 250th anniversary of the foundation of the United States, and it will be interesting to see how it will be marked this July 4th by Trump. But we will see, by the Trump administration. But let's just go back to the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, Monroe Doctrine is proposed. When it was proposed, what it was simply saying is that the Europeans should keep out of the affairs of the Americas. So that was in fact welcomed by many Latin American countries who saw it as the United States basically speaking not just for itself, that, you British and you Europeans don't meddle with us, but also for all the Americas, that had recently become independent, in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. So they welcomed it. And then, and of course, in those days, the United States really had no military capacity to enforce it if the Europeans had chosen to violate it anyway. But then, almost 100 years later, in the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt is supposed to have added a corollary, and that is supposed to have, people don't talk about it very much, but and the corollary is, that we get to do what we like in the Americas. But actually, I think it needs to be read at a more profound level. Historically, the Europeans created a system of international law in which you were only obliged to play by the rules of international law when you were playing with another civilized country, playing, warring, whatever, but whatever you were doing. But as far as the rest of the world was concerned, there were no rules. The gloves came off. There was, etc. And essentially, if you read what the Roosevelt corollary says, it is the pronunciation of an American version of this standard of civilization argument, that those countries in the Americas that transgress certain boundaries, we have the right, literally he uses the word police them. You don't police something internationally, you have to fight a war. When you use the word police, it's like you are treating it as if that country has no sovereignty, it has no existence. You can go in and do whatever you like to their people, to their land, etc., etc. And I think that is the right which the Americans claimed for themselves. And then, in the national security, and by the way, to come back to your point, the standards that they are applying, absolutely. Did they, Macron and all the Europeans are so upset about the sovereignty of Denmark being violated, but as we were talking earlier, they have been violating the sovereignty of so many other countries, and this is their version of, they don't use these words, but they are implicitly operating on this standard of civilization kind of argument. And their standard of civilization basically is, if you do what we want you to do, great. If you don't, we are going to do whatever we like. Just a small other point, when we were told in the national security document that came out last November. And I say came out, like practically stealthily, because there was no ceremony, there was no announcement or anything. It's almost as if they're not sure this is really their doctrine. But in it, they claim that there is now a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. If you read the Trump corollary, it's all about drug smugglers and immigrants and so on. So really, kind of what's going on is that the United States has come so far down in the world compared to, say, the Teddy Roosevelt's time, that there is no serious foreign policy content to this Trump corollary. It is as though, it's like in that movie, Wag the Dog, the domestic politics tail is wagging the foreign policy dog. And this is written all over the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is that, basically today, the United States is today in such dire straits that the government can no longer have a viable foreign policy. The government must constantly look at how it's gaining support or losing support and tailor their foreign policy to that. And I think that's where we are at, basically. And by the way, that applies to a lot of other things we're going to talk about as well.
Yes. Well, one of the things Carney says is, today I will talk about a rupture in the world order. Is it really a rupture if you're in Africa? The same thing's going on. If you're in what happened? What changed for me now? I've got a puppet in charge of my government who I've got U.S. Special Forces going around, making the world free for speculative capitalists, So it's a rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction. Pleasant. I don't think it's pleasant if you're in the global South and you're impoverished and mistreated. The end of and the beginning of a harsh reality where the geopolitics of great powers is not subject to any constraints. Here's what I'm going to say. I will say, on the other hand, that other countries, especially the middle powers like Canada, that's telling. The term middle powers is very telling. Your thoughts on that? I think that's a powerful business that's describing something to you. You have to interpret what he means by middle powers and what this whole comment that he's making. Since he considers himself the middle powers, he's saying all of this stuff that I'm talking about, put it all in the context of through the lens of me, the middle powers, which means I'm also speaking for France and Germany and these other not ungreat powers.
So first of all, let me say that, you're quite right. There's a lot packed in here. So let's unpack it a little bit. So the one thing I would say is that, of course, you are right. Carney is referring to Canada and all the European countries because they are all small. And by the way, I should point out that, it is remarkable if you look at a map of the world, how tiny actually the countries of Europe are. And the reason for that, why is Europe divided up into so many tiny countries? The reason for that is very simple. It's capitalism. We are always told that there was the wars of religion and so on, but they were the wars that were the birth pangs of capitalism. And so in a certain sense, Europe has been suffering this fate thanks to capitalism. And of course, they made up for it for a century, almost a couple of centuries, by having vast empires abroad. And then once these European countries lost those vast empires abroad, then they became reduced to the status of middle powers. And I think that this is a key point that we have to remember. And of course, the capitalist big power that was left standing was one that was based on a settler colonial project, which essentially eliminated the native population, or more or less eliminated, not completely, I'd like to underline, but it more or less eliminated the settler population. And so in a certain sense, it's based on genocide. It's based on genocide, it's based on slavery, it's based on all of these things. And of course, a large part of the problems of the United States come from there. Part of the reason why Trump has been elected president is because the white elite of the United States is basically using ordinary white people and so on to somehow and convincing them that they have something to fear from non-white people in the United States, and so on, and somehow that if they become a minority, this is going to be a big problem, and so on. So that legacy continues to dog the United States. But okay, anyway, so that's one thing, is Europe is a bunch of middle powers, and so is Canada, and so on. The second thing they're talking about when they talk about themselves as middle powers, of course, is that they are lumping China and Russia and the United States all in a single group, and somehow we have to negotiate the turbulent waters created by all these big powers, and these big powers are essentially, we have to deal with them warily. Earlier it was only China and Russia. Now they are, at least for now, classifying the United States in that. But again, remember the break with Trump is, it's not that great. I mean, they still want NATO to continue to exist. They still want the United States to remain part of NATO, even when the European countries sent troops to Greenland. It wasn't to defend Greenland against the threat of an invasion by Trump, which he did threaten. I don't think he was serious about it, but he did threaten it. It was said, we were told, it was to defend Greenland from Russia and China. When did this Russian and China threat suddenly materialize? One of the reasons why I never thought Trump would ever invade Greenland is because he can send as many troops. He has actually, the United States, under an agreement that was made in the late 1940s, the United States has the power to station an unlimited number of troops in Greenland. So why would it even be an invasion? In what sense would it be an invasion? I have no idea. Anyway, the point is, if he really wanted control over Denmark, etc., he would have gone around it in a completely different way. He would have strong-armed. He might, if he had done it quietly in behind closed doors, he might even have convinced Denmark finally to sell Greenland to him. He doesn't want that. He wanted to create a big kerfuffle so that he could come out looking big. But anyway, to finish the point about the small countries, is that they don't want the rupture. They don't want to break with the United States. Even now, and Russia and China are far from threatening Greenland. Russia is the biggest country in the world. It does not want more territory. And the big, how can you say, people say that Putin wants to take over Ukraine, etc. Putin did not do anything for 8 years after the conflict emerged. He only did it after it was plain that the Ukrainians were going to intensify their attacks on Donbass, even more than they had been, to a level even higher than that had been the case for the previous 8 years. So anyway, long story short, I think that all these Western powers, these Western countries, they just want, the world that they used to have, the one that they look back with nostalgia at, they just want it back.
One more passage that I have to read to get from Carney's speech, and as soon as you hear it, you're going to know that I had to read this. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false.
Yes.
That the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depended on the identity of the accused or the victim. He's saying that in the midst of all of this Ukraine stuff. But let me continue. This fiction was useful. It's still pretty useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collectively security, and support for frameworks of resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window, we participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We're in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. In the context of current European policy against Russia, they just admitted that everything we're saying is about Russia is a lie, that everything we're doing is false. We're doing it just for money. We're doing it so it benefits us. But come on, America, come back on board and do this, because we're doing this with Russia. We can't like let people onto it, even though we kind of really are. And that's what's interesting, that in the context of what's going on with Russia, that he would say this, and Ukraine.
Well, exactly. I mean, his meaning was really that now that the United States has gone rogue, that we have to, that the United States itself seems to be bent on breaking this order, then we have to accept that it's gone. But it was good while it lasted. And you're right. He admits the hypocrisy of the dealings of the West with the rest of the world towards Russia, towards China, towards Iran, towards Venezuela, towards Cuba, you name it. There's a very, very long list of the West's misdemeanors, crimes and misdemeanors vis-a-vis the rest of the world, for which the world is still paying. So, and that's what I meant, when I said earlier that the Carney talks about the world which as it is and the world as we wish it to be. And the world as they wish it to be has not changed. They still wish for that world. He's still mourning for that world. When he says, it's a bit like, I have, he has come both to praise that order and at least ostensibly to bury it, although I don't think they're burying it. I think it's still there. Trump has made a lot of song and dance, and he really made the Europeans very angry and quake in their shoes. But look what happened afterwards. Mark Rutte and Trump went off into a little meeting room, and they have now come out and said that they are all going to resolve it. So whatever. So I think that the Europeans and the US will be back into some kind of a condominium, some kind of a relationship, because the thing is that they need each other. What else are they going to do? I think the main thing now is that Trump is not even saying to them, stop the war with Russia. What he's saying to them is, you pay for that. Meanwhile, we need to concentrate on other more important things. That's what the Europeans are so upset about.
What I read from this is simple, because he admits it. Look, this worked economically for us. We worked with you. You were the brawn. We went around. Yes, we lied. We cheat. It's Mike Pompeo. We lied. We cheated. We stole. We had classes on it, right? It's the same thing. He comes out and says, look, yeah, we lied to everybody. We contradicted ourselves. We were hypocritical. Yes, we did all those things, but it worked and we made money.
Yes.
So to me, here's what I hear. Look, this thing was working, man. We were like, we were all trying to eat here. We were doing well. Hey, come on. So get back on the wagon, chill out. We're all right. We're not mad. We understand. We're just trying to remind you that we all need to eat. That, yeah, okay, we're not, do we call you a liar and a chief and a thief and a cheat? Yes, we do. And are you one? Yeah. But quiet as is kept, so are we. And this is what we all do. So now that it's out in the open, we tried to pretend to everybody that we were holier than thou. Because of the way things have happened, and if you read later, he talks about economic problems and all that. Because of the way everything's went down, okay, it's all out in the open now.
Yes.
We can't hide it anymore. But this works. So chill out and get back on board, and let's go out and get this money. That's what I hear from it.
Yeah, the thing is that the larger context in which all of this is playing out is the context of the decline of Western power. Now, when Western power is declining, there are two extreme possibilities and then everything in between. So one extreme possibility is that they all huddle together and they go down together. The second possibility, which is probably highly unlikely, the second possibility is that they start accusing each other of blaming each other for it's you did something wrong, that's why. So Trump is doing that. Trump is saying, look, you are a burden on us, that's why America is not great, you look after yourself. So now thieves are falling out, and what the wonderful thing that happens when thieves fall out is that the truth comes out, because they all start accusing each other. They start washing the dirty linen in public. And so we get to read about, we don't have to go to all the alternative media to read about it. The Guardian and the Financial Times will tell you what Trump did wrong, and etc. And then Trump's side will tell you what they did wrong. So all of this stuff will start coming out. And just to take one, Carney was saying that the United States provided public goods, and they kept, what is it, open sea lanes and a stable financial system and so on. But the fact of the matter is that, of course, what the public goods, insofar as they were, they may have been public goods in a common system of imperialism, in which the middle powers, as Carney calls them, were kind of free riders to some extent. And so they got to kind of go along for the ride. But the stable financial system as well. This is really interesting. I gave a talk not long ago, a few months ago, in which I said that the United States, the dollar-based international financial system, is the biggest inequality generating machine in the whole world. That it has acted as a kind of giant octopus that has sucked up value created by workers, by businesses, even by small businesses, and even medium businesses, and even medium to large businesses, and by governments. Everything, that all the income of these people has been directed towards the financial sector, in particular those sitting at the upper echelons of the dollar-denominated financial sector. And that's why the whole world is awash in debt. Families are indebted, small businesses are indebted, governments are indebted, and they are sucking up all the interest. That's how they are essentially garnering our wages, our profits even, and government revenues even. That's what they're doing. So that's, so this public service, the only reason why people like Carney liked it is that the financial sector of countries like Canada got to piggyback on it. The financial sectors of European countries got to piggyback on it. These were not public goods for the world. These were instruments of oppression for the rest of the world.
Yes, definitely, definitely. I think I think that the last thing I'll say about this speech is, and here's the interesting part about it. They call this the World Economic Forum. World Economic Forum. Is he talking to Russia and China and India here? No. Africa, Latin America? No. It's the World Economic Forum. They use, it's like they have the World Series here in the United States for baseball.
That's right.
The rest of the China, but Japan has a baseball. Why they're not involved? It can't be the. It is this Eurocentric, Western-centric that says the World Economic Forum is about maintaining the system of dollar hegemony and Western hegemony so that we can continue. So what's interesting about that is he admits we've been lying and cheating and stealing from the rest of the world. That's the World Economic Forum. And he says, and we need to keep doing it, or, come on. Yeah, we're the mid powers. And in a way, I think he's trying to tell Trump, and you guys have been benefited. You're going to lose too. You think you're going to win, but you're not going to win. But that concept that he's talking only to, it's like this. You're the leader. And because you have the most power, we all benefit. And on behalf of all the mid countries who you're dragging along behind you, you're leaving us behind and we're hurting. But if you think about it, you're not going to benefit. So don't do that. It's like he's speaking for a discussion outside of the majority of the world.
Correct. It is. You are so right. It's the world. I mean, mind you, there are people who come from third world countries as well. Apparently, right. This year, there was a record, nearly 70 heads of state and government were actually there. So in that sense, it is. But you're absolutely right in the more substantial. So in a formal sense, you may say it's maybe World Economic Forum, but in a substantial sense, it's absolutely about the preservation of Western power. That has been, this thing was thought up back in 1971 by this guy called Klaus Schwab. And since that time, its main function has been to peddle the free market, free trade agenda, the globalization agenda. And, The difficulty of that is that basically the globalization agenda, the free market, free trade agenda, has been one in which the Western world has said to the rest of the world, open yourselves up to our corporations, our needs, whether it is to sell you things or to buy things from you cheaply or to sell things to you expensively. But whatever it is, we want you to be open to our trade. And of course, as far as all developing countries are concerned, all the rest of the world is concerned, that is the sort of the shortest route to economic disaster, right? It is like, go straight from A to B, do not pass go, do not collect any cash on the way, etc. No, it is the shortest and swiftest path to ruin, and that is kind of what happened to much of the third world in the 80s and the 90s. But of course, in the new century, things began to change. Many third world governments, even if they may not have been particularly democratic, had to retain some modicum of legitimacy, etc., etc. So things began to change. But anyway, to come back to this, so the rest of the world would have so this demand for free trade, etc., was simply a demand for a sort of openness that is absolutely against development. If they really wanted, and by the way, in the long run, it also destroys trade, because of course, if you destroy much of the world economy, which is what this has done, then the world economy is not capable of consuming the things you are producing, or is not stable enough to allow you to invest money in there, and so on. So in a certain sense, globalization has been a self-limiting project. So this was, if Mark Carney is calling this a rupture, believe me, he is not saying it's a rupture from globalization. He wants the globalization to continue, but somehow it's going to continue without the United States. Mr. Carney, that's not, you're not even, like, if you think you're living in the world as it is, you are not, because without the US driving it, with all these small middle powers having to deal with the rest of the world, deal with China, Russia, etc., on their own, what they're going to get is not some new version of globalization.
What's interesting also is that, and let me ask you about this, and something that you're familiar with. It seems to me that the Russians are doing everything they can to kind of mend the problems between India and China. That the Russians are that, I've been to Russia recently. It seems to me, and it just as an outside observer, it seems to me that the Russians see bringing China. God knows the leadership of India has their issues that we could discuss, right? Notwithstanding the internal issues there, and the issues they'll have doing it. But I do think that they are right in understanding that from an economic perspective, that it would be critical for what they're trying to build in the BRICS to do that. Your thoughts on the India-China relationship, what the Russians and probably others are trying to do to bring them as close as possible, and the internal issues that may help or hurt that?
So first of all, I completely agree with you, of course, that Russia would dearly love to see a situation in which China and India get together. Unfortunately, I don't see the path to that being very smooth at all. Not because China is doing anything particularly wrong. I mean, while there may be mistakes here and there, on the whole, I think China has sought to keep the door open to a reasonable resolution to border conflicts, and then keep the door open to trade and investment relationships with India. It has done a lot to try and get India to join the BRI, to join the RCEP, the trade, the reciprocal, whatever trade partnership, I forget what it was, the full name was, but RCEP, as it was called, reciprocal comprehensive something partnership, economic partnership. So in all of these ways, but India, under the present government in particular, simply cannot reciprocate. Indeed, the Modi government, which is at the very least an extreme far-right authoritarian government, some would say fascist government, is so committed to a very anti-China path that in the course of and because India cannot stand up to China on its own, over the past decade, if not longer, it has been cozying up to the United States more and more. Now, you might think there might be two aspects to this relationship, that American and there may be closer economic relations and then closer military and security relations. But actually, uh, the other thing that is not often talked about is that the Modi government, contrary to all the Western press, which loves to talk up India on the whole, and talk up its growth rates in particular. Oh, look at India is growing at 5 and 7 and 8%. These statistics are no longer reliable. Just as in the United States, Trump's attack on various statistical agencies has created a situation in which you no longer have reliable statistics about American growth. So we have had a similar situation in India, where the way in which statistics is collected, and GDP statistics in particular are compiled, have so many structural problems that many say that if you were to measure India's GDP growth correctly, rather than in these biased ways, then you would have to knock off 2 to 3% of India's growth rate, at which point India comes out as having a very mediocre growth rate, particularly when you consider the fact that China is already some 5 to 10 times richer than India in per capita terms. Yeah, in per capita terms. And India, meanwhile, has become the more populous country. But there is absolutely no indication that India will be able to reap the demographic dividend, because India does not invest in its people. India does not invest in the economy in a way that benefits ordinary people. So you may have a lot of people, but you also have a lot of poverty. You have dire hunger, malnutrition, stunted kids, uneducated kids. This is not the way to reap a demographic dividend. So the Modi government, basically, I have argued for in many places, including in writing, it has a 1 point economic program. And that 1 point economic program is do what the big capitalists want the government to do. Not even there, the topmost of the big capitalist, let alone not even the second rung of the big capitalist, or the third rung, or the medium, or the small business people, or what have you. So they are, and that's partly why, by the way, we have forgotten this, but in the last election in 2024, Modi, despite being bankrolled by absolutely unearthly amounts of cash by this corporate capitalist class, despite the support it gets from this fascist organization called the RSS, and despite corrupting the electoral process quite massively, it still lost its majority. So, and this India, one of the Modi, remember I was talking earlier about Trump, and how under him the Trump's domestic unpopularity is leading him to all these foreign policy spectacles, which are supposed to somehow show him in a good light, and therefore increase his polling figures, which have been trending downwards for the past 10 months or so. So Modi is very similar. For Modi has no recognizable foreign policy other than to make India look big, and of course to make himself look big. And so he is, in fact, people joke about this, he is hardly ever in Delhi. He's constantly jetting about the world, giving big, leaders around the world, big hugs and so on, as though this is going to get him more votes. But I think the ordinary Indian realizes that this is not doing their economy any good. This is not doing this, their pocketbooks any good, etc. So, India is unfortunately committed to an anti-China path, which is completely unrealistic. India just does not have the economy, the technological capacity, the human resources, the military to counter China, but it still wants to act as if it counters China. And in the process, it is getting closer and closer to the United States, which is simply bad news for any vision of the RICS, the Russia, India, China vision of RICS. Yeah.
One of the things I think is important, people harken back, and maybe I have an unpopular position. They harken back to the Bandung Conference, right, in the 1950s, and say, the way to go is non-aligned. We need a new non-aligned movement, etc. Right? Okay, I disagree. And I'll tell you why. Look at the Sahel region. Did they go non-aligned? If you are not in a world where these lions are going around grabbing and biting people, if you how do fish survive? They school up. How do you know what I mean? How do animals survive? They get in a bunch, herds of get in a bunch. You may pick one off on the edges here and there, fair enough. You know, the lions will get a slow one who's limping occasionally, but the power is in being together, right? I think that if you look at what happened, if I evaluate the Sahel region, if we're honest about that, I'm not saying these things are related, but I've followed this closely. Africa had this, I mean, excuse me, Russia had this conference on Africa in which they talked about, you know, Africa should be free and the Russians will be, they're going to support Africans' independence. And 3 weeks later, the 3 weeks later, all of a sudden, Burkina Faso, the French get taught. A couple weeks later, Mali, a couple weeks later. So I may be wrong in assuming that completely out in space. It wouldn't shock me if the Russians supported said activities. Here's my point. And clearly, these countries have sided with Russia. And if they did not, the US imperialism, the French imperialism would have knocked them out. So my point is this. You know, maybe if we all, you know, non-aligned sounds so good and it seems so righteous and all those things. But, you know, when the lions go hunting, sometimes you got to pick a side. And I think that the reason the Sahel states are working is because they chose a side. Russia's in there, North Korea's in there, and they said, so I'm not for that. I think, no, I'll put it like this. One other way, non-aligned. If one guy's over here mellowing out saying we can do business, and the other guy's saying, I'll eat you, I think you should decide with the guy who says we can do business rather than say, well, I can't decide whether the guy that just wants to do business with me or the guy that wants to just swallow me whole. No, that's not a choice. So I'm throwing my opposition to the non-aligned movement. Your thoughts, Dr. Desai. Oh, Radhika.
Garland, you are actually probably agreeing more with the non-aligned movement than you realize. I'll tell you why. Because, you know, yes, you're quite right. The name is the non-aligned movement. So, and of course, the original idea was that we're not going to take part in bloc power politics and so on. You know, with the Bandung conference and then later the creation of the non-aligned movement, etc. So, but objectively speaking, the non-aligned movement, because it represented the vast majority of the countries of the world which had just recently become independent from the colonial yoke, or in the case of Latin America, had been independent but still dominated by European powers and so on. So this represented their aspiration for greater autonomy from imperialism. And in this context, Russia and the People's Republic of China eventually were always anti-imperialist forces. So for that reason, if for no other, all these countries, the developing countries, were always leaned leftwards. And indeed, two other points may be made here. They lean leftwards in the sense that, you know, the Soviet Union and China were better friends of the non-aligned movement than the United States was, very simply, and the West. And of course, China and the USSR, when it existed, competed with one another to be more influential in the third world. Of course, their means were limited, and we'll come back to that. This limitation of means remains an important issue. Their means were limited, but they did what they could. So that was a second thing. But there was a third reason why there was an objective alliance between the communist countries and the third world countries, the non-aligned countries. And that is that, you see, for the communist countries and the third world countries, they had one thing in common. The West had industrialized and developed via imperialism. They had exerted imperial power around the world. Now, for the Soviet Union, later the People's Republic, and all the developing countries, they all had to industrialize in ways that differed in at least 3, possibly 4 ways from the industrialization of the Western countries. They had to industrialize without the privilege of imperialism. They could not make another part of the world pay the cost of their development. Number two, they had to develop from a starting point to which they had been pushed back by imperialism. They had been made backward. They had been underdeveloped by imperialism. Whether it is for a few decades, for a century or more, these countries had been ruled by the Western world, and their economies had been destroyed by the Western world. So their starting point was not the starting line, but a position further back. So they had to make up for that. And number three, they had to develop in the teeth of imperialist resistance, because the imperialists did not want them to develop. The imperialists wanted them to remain the producers, the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, the producers of cheap commodities and the senders of labor and so on. So, and a final point, which is often forgotten, is that, when Europe developed, it had the luxury, shall we say, of exporting its excess population to the rest of the world. That's why we have European people living on and constituting still majorities in, let's see, 1, 2, 3 and more, 3.5 continents other than Europe. Yeah. The North and South America, the Antipodes, and of course, part of Africa. So in all of these ways, so there was an objective connection between them. And so now, of course, and in those days, of course, the Bandung spirit and so on, as you were rightly pointed out, they were like the fish, if the small fish have to fight the big fish, they have to band together. And I think that is what they did. Today, the situation is a lot more complex. So on the one hand, I think you have a small group of countries, and I would look at the list of the Friends of the UN Charter or whatever it's called. That's an interesting group. So that includes countries like Russia, China today, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. You can look it up. But, so I think that there are these countries which, by their own inclination or because they have been pushed by the Western world, they have had to take a very strong position against Western domination. And the alliance of Sahel states is part of that, I would say, today. Whereas, we talk about BRICS. But today, and I always said that the BRICS will only succeed to the extent that BRICS countries remain committed to undermining neoliberalism. But what we are seeing now in the context of India, and to a lesser extent Brazil and South Africa, is that these governments, given what they are, they still remain committed to some version of neoliberalism. Obviously, Lula's Brazil is in a different ballpark. But even I hear from what little I can read and about it, I see that Lula is not able to stand up to the power of Brazilian corporate capital, the very powers that put people like Bolsonaro in power. Thankfully, the Bolsonaro episode ended relatively quickly in Brazil. But in India, the Modi, there seems to be no end to that. Meanwhile, in South Africa, you may not have a Modi or a Bolsonaro, but there is still a wider commitment, a practically constitutional commitment to neoliberalism, which was the price of lifting apartheid. And that price is still being exacted against the people of South Africa.
Yeah, I think it is. I would interpret it like this. Maybe I'm wrong. You know far more than me. I would say this. It is a commitment to the dollar and dollar hegemony, but because, as an example, in Brazil, you've got all of these, 30 families or however many families it is that have the power, and their money's in dollars, and their empires and their wealth is in dollars. So, and they have enough horsepower to yank the chains of the people who run the government. So their money being in dollars, this commitment to dollar hegemony. That's why the Russians, hey, we're rubles, that we can't do the dollar anymore. Thank you like Lavrov says, we don't want you to lift the sanctions because we don't want the liberals in our society or the people who to put their money back in dollars or the people who have dollars. And that's going to cause us a problem because they're going to try to yank us towards dollars. We don't, like I said, I was just in Russia and there are a lot of people saying, you keep these sanctions on, that will cause us problems. The Chinese, we see sanctions coming like the Russians, so we don't have a commitment to dollar. India, Brazil, South Africa, I think it is their commitment to the dollar, which is not ideological commitment to the dollar, right? It's an
Oh, it's
economic commitment to the
a
dollar.
pocketbook commitment.
Exactly. Do you think that's a good evaluation of the problem? At least partially.
I think that's exactly right. You know, I was discussing this matter with Paulo Nogueira Batista. He's a very well-known Brazilian economist, and we met at Valdai, and we've sort of corresponded since, and met at Valdai a couple of times, and so anyway, what we agree on is that basically the dollar system is nearing a crash. I mean, it's quite possible that the dollar system will crash, and of course, in the BRICS, you know, lots of people are talking about de-dollarization, and they think that de-dollarization will happen because the BRICS countries and others like them, you know, BRICS Plus and whatever, will essentially create the alternative arrangements that will, undermine, you know, that will shift the world away from the dollar system. But that project is not advancing very far. And my explanation of why that project is not advancing very far is precisely that, particularly in countries like India, Brazil, and so on, the elite of these countries is so invested in the dollar system that they will not really carry forward this. So in a certain, and so my prognosis is that the dollar system will likely crash. I mean, you know, many people are saying that in 2026 we will see a big financial crash. That will also be more or less the end of the dollar system, because the dollar system only works because these elites are enticed into putting their money in there in the hope that they will keep making money. But if this speculative money-making system collapses, and I think once this time when it collapses, there will be no bailing out, then they have no reason. I mean, they will worry about where to put their money. And you can already see the price of gold has gone to $5,000 an ounce. That's a historic high in real terms, as well as in nominal terms.
And crypto will explode, I think, in the short term. That a lot of capital, they will be panicking, and that panic capital will run to gold. It'll search for a safe, and they'll see crypto, and they'll see these things will explode, if only for a short term, or until they come up with a credible alternative that they're comfortable with, at which point these other things will start to. But I think gold, crypto, precious metals, things like that will explode when capital flees the dollar.
Okay, let me just say that I put gold and all other commodities, like real commodities, whether and derivatives based on that, whether it's oil or wheat or whatever, I put them in a different category from financial instruments like stocks, bonds, and crypto. So I think crypto is already part of the bubble. I mean, crypto is in bubble territory. And when the bubble, this everything bubble crashes, I think crypto will go with it. And then, yes, there will be a mad scramble for anything else that can be expected to preserve its value. But I don't think it'll be crypto.
Okay.
Yeah. But the main point you're making is absolutely correct, because the world will scramble. All the rich people in the world will scramble for somewhere to put their money, which will retain its value.
I think you're right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Desai. This has been very, very pleasant conversation, especially since, you know, a couple of things that I've said you've agreed with. That always makes it a lot more fun, you know, when somebody feels like you at least have an idea. But I think I'll put it like this. What I actually think, rather than that I'm some kind of an economic genius, I think some of these things are so glaringly obvious that you're deaf, dumb, and blind if you can't see them. You know what I mean? You don't have to be an economist to figure out some of these things.
In fact, I think that, you know, given the record of economics as a profession, I think it's better if you're not an economist. So.
There's what was that? Wasn't there a book basically that argued that? There's been a lot of discussions about that traditional economics has become an ideology as opposed to a science.
Exactly. In fact, my husband Alan calls it a religion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a religion. It's not really a way of knowing the world. It's a way of blinding yourself from the real world.
Interpreting what happens through it's like I was saying about the person I was debating. Everything that Trump did, she interpreted it through the lens of he's smart and he knows what he's doing. Well, if you're interpreting everything through that lens, or instead of a blank lens that says, let's figure it out and see if it makes sense based on history, based on what's going on now. No, everything he does is brilliant. And so let's figure out why it's brilliant. So that's kind of where a lot of our so-called sciences are, including political science. At any rate, tell everybody where they can find you online.
Radhikadesai.com is my website. By the way, I have a Substack. So if you're interested in what you hear, please join it. It's easy to find. It's Radical Desai, as in radical. And I'm starting a new YouTube channel on which you will also be able to watch this video and many others. I haven't formally launched it yet. I'd like to gather some momentum before I do, but please also subscribe there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you again soon. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. And I thank everybody, my Patreon people and everything. And make sure, if you can, support the channel. And no matter what your financial means are, the most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you. We are out.